Ebba, she's a senior lecturer in urban studies at the Swedish School of Planning at, there we go, Blekinge Institute of Technology, Karlskrona, Sweden, where she's also the director of the master program in urban planning. And so you got your PhD from this institution, right? From the KTH or KTH, urban planning. And now you're also you're specialized in these geographies of welfare, which obviously it's also a topic that resonates pretty much with our focus here. And you are co-supervising, and Ebba is co-supervising this European research project Urban Ist, which is led by the Professor Abdullah Abakan, and you are also national representative in the Association of European School of Planning. So we will start with Ebba with a presentation. You can see already the title, which is a beautiful title, named Making Possible a Life Like Everybody Else, Welfare Planning and Inclusive Living Environment. So please help me in welcoming Ebba to the stage.
So this is Blekinge, where I'm from, Blekinge Institute of Technology. So I will come back and talk about the research project. This presentation will be about the ongoing research project. The ongoing research project I'm currently working on. The title of this presentation indicates what is the prevailing discourse in social service and support for people with disabilities. Like integration and inclusion in the community, and it's often named as community care. And furthermore, the title indicates what is the role of planning in facilitating such living environments. In this research project, we are looking into how municipal sectors, planning offices and social services work and collaborate to implement this policy, and how people with psychiatric disabilities or people with mental ill health experience their everyday life and their local environment, and also in what way the welfare planning could improve to meet these demands. The title of this presentation is not the same as the title of the research project. So the research project, some basic facts. It's called, we call it the LEX project, Sustainable Living Environments for People with Psychiatric Disabilities, aligning housing planning and social services through experimental collaborative practices. And as you can see, we have a nice budget for doing this, funded by two of the main Swedish research agencies or research councils, Formas and Forte. And it started January this year and will go on for 3 years. And it's an interdisciplinary project. So our project leader is Professor Urban Markström from Social Work at Umeå University. And then we are 4 in the groups, and we have another person from the social work discipline, Maria Fjellfeldt, who is in Dalarna University, which is also a bit up north, not as far as Umeå, though. And then it's me and my colleague, Dr. Lina Berglund Snodgrass from Spatial Planning in Blekinge. And we also, as I said, Urban and Maria, they are trained as in social work. And me, I'm trained as an architect, and I have this PhD in planning, as you mentioned. No, where? Yeah. And Lina is a landscape architect and a planning researcher. And as you can see, it's also like it's a cooperation with different universities. Okay. Was there something more I would say with that? No. A brief background, or the first brief background for our project is that following a series of reform since the 1960s, there is this currently strong belief that people with psychiatric disabilities should live as others, this life as everybody else in society. And their well-being concerning housing and social support is predominantly a municipal affair nowadays under the responsibility of the social services. And it's also that the municipalities in Sweden is also responsible for developing housing supply programs that include strategies for addressing the overall housing needs for the citizens in the municipality, including people with disabilities and also our target group, people with psychiatric disabilities or people with mental ill health. So the question is, how do the municipalities work? What do they do? Or do they take into account the lived experience of people with mental ill health? So the overarching purpose of the study is to refine our current understanding of the housing situation for disadvantaged group or vulnerable group, we would call it, and how the needs are accommodated in strategic housing planning. And I will come back to that because that is the work package 1, which we are currently working with. And the work package 2 is to develop better collaborative processes between the municipality sectors and the vulnerable groups or our target group. And that is the second work package, which will start the next year. So, how did it all start? Why? Why the interest in this? In this group of people, there are not so many, so why? And I have to go a short circuit back in time in history of psychiatry. It could be, I mean, this is an iconic painting. It's Pinel, the psychiatrist from La Salpêtrière in Paris. He released the mad from their change. This is the, because at that time, by the end of the 18th century, people with mental ill health, they were held in chains, and there were also like spectacle. People could come and watching them, like a tour, like we nowadays maybe go to zoo or something. But he ordered, that's just the kind of the story, a bit like progressive story. Like he ordered the removal of the chains for patients of this Paris asylum for insane women, and that could be, I mean, it could be told as there was a starting point for a humanizing mental health care. I don't know, some of you have read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and then you remember the first, in the first chapter, he is describing the period before this reform institution emerged, that there was no vision that people could be cured, and that was the same for prisoners as well. So there's a very deep description of an execution of as a public spectacle. But by the end of the 18th century or beginning of the 19th, this idea came that people could be reformed, they could be cured, and to be cured for the people with mental ill health, they also needed to be cared for and confined also. So, and we had a system like this for a long time. This is all over the Western world and all over the world, I would say. That system for care and cure was in confined institutions, often a bit secluded from the rest of the, at least the urban environments, and often in the countryside, or they incorporated quite huge estates with parks and trees and these things. So in Sweden, this is a picture from Långbro, which is in Stockholm. It's now developed as a housing area, but it was built in 1909 and one of the most modern asylums at that time in Sweden. And it was owned by the city of Stockholm. And besides a few asylums run by the local government, the rest was 33 state-owned asylums. And just before the deinstitutionalization era, late 60s, 70s, started, there were almost 36,000 beds in Sweden. So it was a huge system for care, for confinement care and sometimes also cure. In the beginning, there were a lot of hopes. But by the end of this era, most of the asylums were run down, and there came, as I'm sure you're aware, will come other ideas how to best take care of the people with mental ill health had come. And also one, of course, huge driver for that was the drugs, the therapeutic drugs that came in the 50s. Okay. So in the Swedish context, this deinstitutionalization came along perhaps a bit later than in UK or France or US. But basically, I mean, here was the focus of the public debate in the beginning of the 70s, the psychiatry, the psychiatric care and so on. But to jump a bit ahead to, in 1992 there was a governmental report called Welfare and Free Choice, which led to the 1995 Mental Health Act, which is kind of the foundation for today's system of mental health care. And it also, I mean, the deinstitutionalization had already started, and most of the mental health institutions or the old asylums had been or was about to be emptied and closed down by the beginning of the 90s. But this was the, on the administrative level, the law stipulated a clear division between medical treatment and care and support in the community. And it also talk about, so, I mean, if we had all this, the thing Goffman talks about, total institutions, you lived all the hours during the day at one place. Now it's divided. So at some points in your life when you are more distressed, you perhaps need to be admitted to a psychiatric clinic. But most of the time, the idea was to live in the local community with care, with support and service from the community care. And in this is also this is part of the governmental report from 91. It's I actually don't know this delbetänkande, this word in English, but it's part of this Welfare and Free Choice report, and this particular piece is called the right to a dwelling, or the right to dwelling, and it's about this, how should we do it. So in the spatial answer to this, I would say the overarching ideas is to have integration and independence. And the spatial kind of answer to that is to, from the if we had this one structure, to be very simple, the big institution, we had a more diverse cohort of smaller units in the community care, like outpatients care, but also supported living or supported accommodation, but also ordinary housing where you could live, and with support of something, if I translate it from Swedish, it's called a dwelling supporter, which is a person that comes to your home and supports you doing the kind of everyday life things. So, and that time, of course, there was a high expectation on the neighborhood to be the place for recovery, or at least delaying a person's career as a lifelong psychiatric patient at that time. So, this graph, you could see the, how do you say, severe, could you say that? Severe decrease of beds at hospital from the 36,000 in the late 60s, mid 60s to in 1999. What does it say? It says like 5,000 beds, and now I think it's like 3,500 or 4,000. So, but that doesn't mean, I mean, this means that this has been transferred to another form of care in the community. And then with this Mental Health Act, one of our research interest in where did they go, the former patients. So that was the one side is the psychiatric care issue, and the other thing in our project is the planning issue. And as I said, there was a lot of reforms in the psychiatric care business, so to speak. There's also been a lot of reforms for spatial planning since the 90s that changed the rationale for planning substantially, or also you could say since the post-war time, and from a national subsidized notion of a housing for all distributed through the so-called municipal housing companies to a predominantly market-oriented housing sector. So in terms of planning, current policies represent as a shift in the role of the local government from having been a central actor for planning, regulating and delivering housing to, for example, acting as a facilitator for the market. And very briefly, we could say that planning nowadays is governed through joined-up governmental initiatives, and in which collaboration constitutes a key instrument. And collaborative planning here includes the hope that through collaboration in loose networks with various stakeholders, society's challenges as sustainability or housing shortages can be solved. And also it has changed the role of the planner, or it will change the role of the planning, from having been mostly focused on regulation of land use through the development of land use plan or details plan, etc., to being a facilitator or coordinator or process manager or catalyst or urban designer or spatial agent. This is some of the new roles that has already been adopted for planners or will be. Okay, so the collaboration constitutes as such a key instrument for directing development towards desirable directions in which the planner adopts the role of facilitating consensus building processes. But whether collaboration is operating well or it's always the answer of the problem is, of course, an issue to scrutinize. Because it could also cause disappointment if the collaboration doesn't turn out well. But the kind of idea is to ensure a social sustainable housing development, welfare development and urban planning should, according to this new governing ideals, be performed in cross-sectoral collaboration. And that will come to the social services and planning. And there is also part of the foundation or the point of departure for our research is one is the Social Service Act and the other is the Housing Provision Act, because it stipulates that every municipality has to have this housing provision program. What's interesting is that in the Social Service Act it says, or it stipulates that social services should participate in the planning of the groups, the vulnerable groups or the people with psychiatric disabilities in their housing arrangement. But the same formulation isn't in the Planning and Building Act. So it's kind of the social service might have a driver for cooperate with the planning office, but the planning office maybe don't see the need for that. So what this quote is a translation from the Housing Provision Act, but you can see the kind of soft governance thing that it says. It create guidelines, to create preconditions, and to promote, instead of kind of a hard or, the hard government thing that you really force or steer. Okay. This is what we are doing right now. We are mapping 10 Swedish municipalities. We are investigating their housing provision strategies and the cooperation between planning offices and social services. So we are doing semi-structured interviews and we're also looking into this housing provision programs. And in the next work package 2, we will work together with one municipality with the action research approach. Also about this multi-actor collaboration, and we will also include in the research or in this study people with the lived experience, people with psychiatric disabilities or people with long-term mental ill health, to really get to know the everyday life or the living environment. So you can see these are 10 municipalities, a kind of mini Sweden. Some in the north, some in the south, some in the east, some bigger municipalities, some smaller, some on the countryside, some rural, and so on. Okay. So of course the main research question is what characterizes strategic housing supply and housing development in Swedish municipalities with regards to the needs of people with psychiatric disabilities, and what characterizes the relationships between welfare service provision and urban planning, and what conflicts and constraints can be identified between these actors. We are also doing a survey over the support and service for the people with, so people who are having this care and support from the community care, I would say, in terms of we are mapping all the supported accommodation in our 10 municipalities in terms of the location and design and the education of the staff and so on. So to finalize this presentation, some preliminary findings. One is this a planning issue? When we approach the people at the planning offices, we have to frame this. If you start talking about this specific target group, they could say, no, we don't. So we always have to, we have to talk about it like a strategic housing provision issue for vulnerable groups, or strategic housing provision in general. And that's interesting, of course. But if we approach social services, it's not okay. I mean, it's their part of their task, so to speak. But it's also that the planning sphere is diverse. It's not only one planning office. It's different kind of planners within the planning office. There are land use planners, the strategic planners, planning strategists. And then there's also the land and development department, the real estate department. And the city architect could be sometimes. So the issue, we are interested in the cuts across the units in terms of the planning, while it's more in the middle of the social services. So there are much more sectors involved in this housing provision issue. So, okay, so the planning sphere are more diverse, yeah. And then it's about cooperation, of course. It exists, but it's not always easy. And there's also a lot about coordination. And there are a few of the municipalities that have this cross-sectoral thematic groups. They're called a housing group, where they gather all the kind of public officials that are involved in this provision, mostly then supported living or supported accommodation. Then if you talk about locational consideration, there seems to be a consensus about these kind of living environments should be located near the public transportation. But also not too concentrated, not too many at the same place, which could sometimes it's also contradictory to the efficiency of running this in terms of staff and so on. Because this location near public transportation could be, or no, it is a problem in smaller rural communities, municipalities, because the public transportation is not at the same level as in here. And this group often they have low income and not often have a car. Okay, so what we have seen, there is a diversity of tools that the planners use or social services and the plan use to take care of this question. There could be the social contracts, or the subletting. The social services has the contract, and the people are renting it. This is the supported accommodation I talked about. We have the dwelling supporter. The municipal housing companies is an important actor in this. If you take it from where it starts, it's also about the land allocation and how you decide what will we do with this piece of land or not. And sometimes it's also outsourcing of this people, some of these more difficult cases to other municipalities. And then, of course, just to mention, is also this issue which was at stake in the deinstitutionalization about the institution and the non-institutional like, and it's still an issue, but it's very hard to actually nail down what is a non-institutional like environment. Is it without corridors or something? That is. So I guess my time is out. I think there was one thing I would say at this general level. We're talking about planners. What is an inclusive living environment? They often talk about meeting places, and then is it a square or was it? And then we could ask, what do you mean, and how do you design or organize a meeting place that's inclusive? And that is, of course, an issue which is hard to give a straight answer of it. In one municipality said, no, we will have different kind of meeting places, and in that sense it will be inclusive, because there is one group couldn't find this place is for me, and other groups would go to another place. So. Okay, thank you.